Design for Equitable Communities, a measure from AIA's Framework for Design Excellence. Let's talk about some learning objectives and also some suggestions when using this lens while looking at your next project. Please think about walkability, human scale, alternative transportation, social equity, and community engagement. With regards to a question portion, as a reminder, using the Q&A box in the lower or upper menu bar of your Zoom window, feel free to type in questions for our panelists to answer during the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. And now I will like to hand it off to our program moderator, Adrian Steichen, AIA. Some information about Adrian. As a principal at PiaTalk, Adrian brings nearly 20 years of experience to student and multifamily residential developments, leading several large urban housing projects in San Francisco and Oakland. Since 2001, Adrian has been an active member of the AIA, having served in various capacities on the local, state, and national levels. Most recently as 2020 president for the AIA's San Francisco chapter. Also, Adrian has served on juries for the National AIA Housing and AIA HUD Secretary Housing Awards, ACSA AIA Housing Design Education Award, Bank of America Low Income Housing Challenge, and AIA Minnesota's Affordable Housing Design Awards. Adrian presented on the subject of urban housing at APA National and AIA California conferences and throughout the Bay Area, including at SPUR, AIA San Francisco, and the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. Adrian is a licensed architect in California and Oregon, a lead accredited professional in VD plus CN Homes, and holds a Master of Architecture from Tulane University with a minor in film studies. In 2015, the American Institute of Architects nationally recognized Adrian as one of its young architects of the year. Adrian, you are on.
Have to unmute myself, sorry. Thanks, Carlo. Realizing greater equity in the design of communities necessitates that decision makers and design professionals create more specific and direct alignments between policy goals and physical implementation. Finding common ground, managing expectations, and tying solutions to real-world conditions and localized environments are essential. In contrast to overarching regulatory structures that target larger cultural desires, design thinking has real potential to address civic and private space inequities directly, especially with respect to housing production. Design can be a potent tool in shaping community-based conversations and affecting meaningful change. By aligning advocacy conversations and policy objectives with design strategies, new housing solutions can influence how equitably designed neighborhoods might mature and can provide access to wealth building and healthier, thoughtfully programmed, sustainable, resilient, and environmentally responsive living patterns more successfully. So on our panel today, you'll hear from Ben Metcalf. Ben is the Managing Director of UC Berkeley's Turner Center for Housing Innovation. Ben helps lead both the expansion and deepening of the Turner Center's work solving housing affordability challenges through policy, practice, and innovation. Prior to joining the Turner Center, Ben was appointed in 2015 by the former Governor Jerry Brown to lead California's Department of Housing and Community Development, a role he held until 2019. Ben played an instrumental role in the passage and implementation of the 2017 housing package and oversaw the department during a period of significant expansion of the state's financial and regulatory reach into housing and land use matters. Prior to joining HCD, Ben worked in the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington, D.C., including as an appointee of President Barack Obama in the role of Deputy Assistant Secretary overseeing HUD's Office of Multifamily Housing Programs. Before then, he developed mixed income and mixed use communities with California-based Bridge Housing Corporation. Ben is the principal and founder of Stronger Foundations, LLC, a housing policy and practice consulting firm. After Ben, we'll hear from Rick Abramson, FAIA, city architect and urban designer and architect studio manager for the city of West Hollywood. Rick led his design firm, Workplace Studio Architecture, until 2019, when he joined the city of West Hollywood in the role of city architect and established its new urban design and architecture studio. A former Fulbright scholar to Italy, Rick has taught at universities for 18 years. He served a 3-year term representing California on AIA National Strategic Council, led professional and built environment legislative efforts resulting in 2 bills signed by Governor Brown, and is currently serving as the chair of AIA California's Housing Congress, exploring design-inspired solutions to the state's housing challenges. Last but not least, John Lum Aia, founding principal of John Lum Architecture, Inc. John has dedicated his 30-plus-year career to designing sustainable, functional spaces that uniquely address his clients' values and personalities. Since founding his firm in 1994, John has grown his practice from an exclusive single-family residential studio into a bustling office that also designs affordable and market-rate multifamily housing, commercial and retail interiors, and institutional work. An award-winning architect, he continues to evolve his work, incorporating sustainable solutions, fiscal responsibility, and social purpose with a pragmatic, no-nonsense approach. He believes the role of the architect is to effect change through community involvement, and sits on the AIA San Mateo County Board and the SFAIA Housing Committee, advocating for smart housing policy and appropriate density. This year for San Francisco AIA, he interviewed newly appointed SF Planning Director Rich Hillis about his vision for the city and what policy and process changes he would like to implement to address the lack of affordable housing and the crisis therein. And for the San Francisco Center for Architecture and Design Neighborhood Series, he moderated a panel of Mission District activists and historians to discuss this vibrant community and the changes and development pressures facing this newly recognized cultural district. In 2018, he received the AIA California's Presidential Citation for his participation in the California Housing Crisis Conference. Thank you, and Ben will get us started.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Adrian. And I'm going to start us off by going small. Let me share my screen, and then I'll explain what I have in mind here. So where I want to take us to begin is sort of a dive into the new and evolving landscape around accessory dwelling units, which again might seem like a rounding error in the scope of all of our challenges with building equitable communities, but I'm going to argue is really a hotspot for change and an opportunity for all of us to think about the ways in which many of our communities, many of which are already single-family neighborhoods in particular, can evolve over time. So first of all, why? Why do we care? Why do we care about a homeowner who wants to convert a garage or add a cottage in their backyard? Well, there's several reasons, and they really check a lot of the boxes, particularly for the topic that we're here to discuss. Some of them are obvious and are just economical. One is by leveraging existing land and properties, we lower the cost structure of new housing. The other is that these are new homes that can be built rather quickly. Whereas it can take years to move a new project forward, construction. ADUs today are approved over the counter. There is a by right or ministerial context in every city in California now that limits the ability, really prevents planning departments from and elected officials from denying applications to add accessory dwelling units. Actually, today in California, you can add 2 accessory dwelling units to a single family home if one of those 2 is within the existing structure of your home. Importantly, this is also an opportunity with ADUs to add naturally affordable housing into communities that have historically not provided that. So single family homes with very high price points or high rents, into that, we can now add these smaller units that can target lower income individuals or smaller households. ADUs leverage existing infrastructure. They don't require new service territory. They don't require new roads, new mains, new power lines. And they offer to assist us in our work around climate more broadly by adding existing people and existing density to our built environment and not necessitating outward sprawl. You know probably what many of these look like because you've seen them yourselves, but just a reminder that ADUs today in California can uplift the design character of existing single family homes, and they can be built in all kinds of different ways. Here are 5 different typologies ranging from conversion of the existing structure to the backyard cottage typology. And they're booming. So this is the story here in California in particular, and we in California are really pulling a page from the Pacific Northwest that has been in the space ahead of us. But we're seeing incredible multiples of permits getting pulled, more than 2 times as many completions from 2018 to 2019. It's hard to know where we'll land because in 2020, because it's been such a unique year, but our expectation is that we will see this growth rate continue through 2020. So why is that? Well, one obvious story here about ADUs and the opportunity they represent is simply that we have a lot of structure that's been built in places like California that are housing fewer and fewer people. So going back to 1950, we averaged 292 built residential square feet per person. Today, that number is, actually, I only have through 2013, but that number is north of 1,000 square feet per person. At the same time, we also see a lot of large lots that are underutilized. So we have a double opportunity of both more housing and larger lots that we can take advantage of to sort of build back in some of the density that we used to see in our single-family neighborhoods a couple generations ago. This I just pulled from the city of Oakland. These are their development standards for ADUs, and I've highlighted in red here some of the standards which the city of Oakland has onboarded that are now state requirements. So what we've seen over the last several years is the state of California pretty aggressively pushing minimum standards for cities in terms of what they can allow and disallow for ADUs, and these are pretty significant. So again, every city in California has to have a ministerial process for approval of ADUs. And you can see here those ADUs by law, cities must allow them to go up to within 4 feet from the rear and side lot lines. They can go up to 14 feet tall. They can be at least 800 square feet. The state now mandates no additional parking is required for that additional ADU if it's within a quarter mile of transit. It doesn't have to have an owner occupancy requirement. And the ADU can be rented. In fact, a homeowners association must allow those ADUs as well. So you can see, get a sense here of the ways in which we've really opened up the ADU space up and down the state, new today in 2020 in a way that we didn't have 3 or 4 years ago. What I'm interested in is also where these ADUs are getting built. And this chart is a little confusing to read, so I apologize for that. But what I've tried to do here is look at the census tracts in the state of California broken down by median income. So on the right are the census tracts in California that house the highest income median Californians. On the left are the ones with the lowest incomes. And what you'll see here is that permits and completions are definitely lower in the lower income tracts in California and slightly higher in the highest income tracts, but they're not that far off. In fact, what we can really observe here is that really across all income levels, neighborhoods at different, serving different average incomes, we are seeing ADUs getting permitted and completed. And in addition, when you look at this by race, you also see that we're seeing significant permitting and completion activity in our majority non-white neighborhoods, as well as our majority white neighborhoods. The UC Berkeley did a study recently, earlier this year, looking at what cities were telling us were the barriers to ADU development moving forward. And with all these state laws, it's interesting now that the top item of concern is really a financing one and a financial one. So today, homeowners may not be aware that they have this option. Obviously, they may not desire to do it, but the one thing that they're struggling with is financing. And I actually think that's actually fixable in many ways. We're probably going to see changes with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, particularly FHA as well, as they play catch up to this burgeoning sector. This chart gives you a sense of how this works in practice. You know, when you think about a homeowner with a given home, you have homeowners that are higher income and lower income, and then you have homes themselves that have more equity versus lower equity. Not surprisingly, the place where we see the greatest financing challenge is among lower income homeowners with very little retained equity. However, for many California homes, we do have reasonable equity, and so those low-income homeowners today are able to begin to take advantage of certain kinds of Fannie Mae and FHA products. These products are a little clunky, but again, we think they're going to evolve over the next couple of years to really facilitate the growth in this area. The other thing, this is sort of to take a big step back for a second, but we're also seeing shifts more broadly in how cities are doing their global planning as a consequence of new mandates coming down from the state through the regional housing needs allocation or RHNA process. You may have heard a little bit about this. The Southern California region notably got a very, very high allocation. Their planning targets for the new housing that they need to be onboarding through increased zoning has shot up significantly since previous cycles. But in addition, the state is now requiring that as cities do their forward planning to accommodate growth, they have to allocate that growth in ways that are more aligned with fair housing goals. As it relates to ADUs, that means in particular that our more exclusionary single-family communities are now seeing larger growth targets that they're getting, and that those cities and communities are having to more intentionally plan for naturally affordable, lower and moderate income housing within our more affluent neighborhoods. This means that cities, to solve their RHNA mandates, are going to be more intentionally working to promote ADU solutions and to spur the growth that we're already beginning to see. What does RHNA do? How does it work? I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's a little bit complicated, but just a reminder that every 8 years, the state determines housing targets for lower income, moderate income, and above moderate income housing growth, gives a target to every region in the state. The regions then allocate out actual targets that their member cities have to plan for across each of these income categories. Those local governments then have to update their zoning and update their housing regulations to be able to credibly show that there's a path for that new housing to get developed over the next 8 years. And then the state reviews and approves those housing elements and monitors their annual progress report. This progress is playing out in real time for the 6th cycle of the housing element, and we can expect, again, cities up and down the state of California to be much more aggressively and intentionally promoting and facilitating ADUs as a way to solve this RHNA issue. Here, for example, is the Southern California number, 1.3+ million new homes that have to get planned for over the next 8 years. And these targets are getting assigned out across the regions in ways that have to achieve multiple state goals, both a climate change oriented goal, as well as a fair housing goal, as well as a jobs housing goal. So these targets can no longer be satisfied simply by parking a growth in exurban inland areas. This growth will have to get accommodated in our built out infill context. And I think that's what's going to be very interesting, both for the RHNA process and specifically for ADUs in the next couple of years as this planning works its way forward from the state to the regions to the cities themselves. I mentioned fair housing. One of the things that cities are now doing is actually pulling down a new fair housing mapping tool that the state has embraced, that we at UC Berkeley helped build, an opportunity mapping tool that looks at the census tract level to sort for every given region which census tracts we expect to have the greatest sets of amenities and resources, and which tracts we expect to be least facilitative of economic mobility and have the highest existing segregation and poverty. We expect to see cities using mapping tools like this as a way of very intentionally targeting where they support and invest ADU development. Again, targeting those areas that have historically seen very little growth at hand. You can learn more and follow this work on the state of California's website. You can see how cities are doing in meeting their compliance on the RHNA and the housing element. I encourage you to check that out. And I've provided here 3 great websites with a lot of information for those of you who are curious. aducalifornia.org, which is a site that we've built here at UC Berkeley to track local ADU ordinances in California. There's a new statewide coalition, Casita Coalition, which has a whole bunch of great tools and advocacy info. And then, of course, the state has its own guidebook and resources, which are also very helpful. I will stop there. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ben. Next, we'll hear from Rick.
Okay, thank you. All right, so you're able to see my screen? We're good to go. Okay. All right, well, thanks, Ben. So I'm going to be going through fairly quickly a few concepts about equity and design and sort of the relationship within housing and urbanized areas in particular. Let's see. There we go. So, you know, for me, the question of housing really starts at the level of city and the public spaces, and where, in fact, housing gets integrated and how it gets integrated in a specific, meaningful way. In particular, as urbanized areas grow more dense, I think it's incumbent upon us as design professionals to really spend more and more time on the space outside of the building, on the streets, and how streets really are going to be transforming in order to accommodate that sort of increase in density and housing units. And two real thoughts with relationship to streets and how they tie into housing. One is that, you know, we're going to have to be far more sympathetic, is what I call it, to be more equitable from a socioeconomic and accessibility standpoint, allowing for all types of mobility. There's going to be an interesting sort of confluence of different interests, especially on the sidewalks. You know, we're going to start seeing robot deliveries and other things integrated into conventional either pedestrian spaces or adjacent, say, bicycle spaces or parklet or planted areas. So there'll be an interesting dynamic there. And then also understanding on the right that the streets themselves in certain opportunities can be much more transformable. And that at certain points, cars can be blocked off and streets start to become more public spaces, pedestrian oriented in particular. And so I think especially larger housing projects start going in, these are going to be something to consider. So one thought when we talk about equitable communities is on the socioeconomic side, and specifically with respect to urban context and urban programming. And so I've been a big advocate in the last few years from moving away from conversations about density that are purely numerical based and more into conversations about what makes equitable socioeconomic intense spaces. And by intensity, I mean all the things that we talk about that as a society we're interested in terms of safety and accessibility and resilience and climate, et cetera. But specifically, how does housing get integrated with a certain intensity where all of these things can be integrated into the design process? And so in particular, the relationship of housing to local goods and services and even programming in and around the housing becomes really important, because it makes no sense to integrate all this housing where, you know, you have to get on transit to go buy a loaf of bread. That just makes no sense. So how we start integrating the housing units in specific contexts with relationship to the gaps that are in place and how they fill gaps, I'm going to talk about in a minute. So right now, we rely on the private sector to do most of our housing. Yes, nonprofit housing corps are out there, and they do a good job for what they're able to do. But the reality is that the majority of the housing is reliant upon private for-profit development. And through state policy in particular, what used to have some aspects of qualitative living incorporated, especially at the local level, has pretty much moved away. And that now, based on policy coming out of Sacramento, it's almost entirely quantitative. It's almost entirely based on density, with special provisions for height and parking being adjusted, and all kinds of incentives and waivers given to developer interest to basically move outside of any local standards that they may feel they don't want to integrate. And on the other hand, I think, at the local level, there is interest in the qualitative. And if we're going to have true conversations about climate and climate action, I think it's essential that design be a part of that equation, and that even though it cannot be subjective anymore based on state guidelines, I think we can still, in an objective manner, try to achieve more equitable spaces in climate responsive design. And as I mentioned, filling in the key gaps with new housing that are missing within local neighborhoods, so that walkability and access in a more equitable manner is possible. And so, the new developments, as they get more intense, as I was saying, need to be thoughtful about, especially at the ground level, at the level of the pedestrian, all the spaces that might need to be there to have a successful, thriving, healthy, climate responsive environment. So what are the economics of that? Well, to me, the greatest shortfall in the state right now has been the growing disparity on the wealth building side. That previous generations, right now, over 80% of those who are 60 years of older have some sort of form of home ownership. And yet only in the low 40% do we see home ownership amongst those approaching their 40s, which is generally the time that most have attempted to move into home ownership by that point in their life in some way. And this disparity has been growing. And traditionally, ownership in real estate has been one means to have somewhat safe and secure access to housing and sort of being able to sleep at night, so to speak. And so if we're going to really talk about equity and climate, I think wealth building is part of that conversation, along with lifestyle diversity. So what do I mean by that? I think part of it is that there's an opportunity now to really relook at historic Euclidean forms of zoning, and how traditionally residential units were sited in a particular zone, separate and apart from all other zones through Euclidean theories. But in fact, what we're seeing is, in order for especially the opportunity to expand wealth building, that these distinctions perhaps need to change, and how we think about housing our future population needs to change. And so one aspect, certainly not the only one, but one aspect of wealth building is figuring out a way for more people to participate in the economy and to house themselves. And so some communities have adopted residential subdivision guidelines, but not so much on the commercial side. And I think that's a huge missed opportunity. By allowing for the subdivision of land into smaller parcels, it becomes more accessible to more people. And the fact that we won't necessarily have as the only option to build housing in urbanized areas these venture capital and hedge fund and REIT type of entities buying up entire blocks to do so. I think that there's an opportunity to think about, especially the commercial zones adjacent to residential, in a different way. Another opportunity for wealth building is something that I worked on with the County of Los Angeles through my former firm. And we were asked to create a new ordinance based on the subdivision of land that would provide for more home ownership opportunities, especially in underserved communities. So the unincorporated part of LA County for the most part, is filled with underserved communities, and this new ordinance really opens the door for wealth building and home ownership without gentrification. And what it did is it looked at subdividing parcels into smaller lots with a limitation of 2 stories, 1,200 square feet, and with guidelines that include required open space. It's an alternating zero lot line ordinance. It was put into effect this past January, and it'll be interesting to see how well it takes. But I think it's an opportunity to really open up this conversation about land ownership and wealth building in underserved communities, while adding more housing units that are greatly needed. On the commercial side, it's not a new idea going back to Europe and even in Pacific Rim countries with shop houses. We see sort of vertical subdivision of land, sort of slivered, sliced approach to density in cities. And on the right, an example of an attempt to do so in one of the Southern California communities by Brian Church, where his firm proposed 4 subdivided live-work type of units, where the idea was that there would be home ownership through these slices, so to speak, each one vertically separated, except when they got to the level of the approvals, the local jurisdiction would not approve this because they did not have a provision within their zoning that allowed it. So it ended up being a conventional mixed-use property where the downstairs or ground level was completely divorced from the housing and occupied by tenants independent of the housing. And it was sort of an unfortunate example of sort of access to the real estate market for those who would normally not have access, that they weren't able to do that. So I've been interested in this idea for quite a while of how we start thinking about more opportunities for more people, and at the same time being very responsive to environmental conditions. So how do you get that intensity that I was talking about earlier with these wealth building opportunities? And so for myself, I tried, I thought I was going to try it out, architect as developer. I bought a little piece of property. It was 25 feet wide. It was sort of an abandoned upholstery shop that had been all closed up. It had been graffitied. And so I looked to transform it. So before on the left and the after on the right, create a new storefront, and then transform the use into a residential duplex in a commercial zone. And so the ground floor is a live-work space. The upstairs is a conventional dwelling unit. And out of this single small slice, created 2 residential units where they weren't there before. And if one were to repeat the pattern across the whole block, one could create about 24 new units without sacrificing some of the concerns of the neighborhood about scale and active street fronts. So this is just a view of the other side, again, built with climate responsive design. And in fact, through the daylighting of this space, the energy bills have been less than $15 a month. It's been sort of a experiment and prototype on my part in sort of eco-friendly design in a laboratory, so to speak, by trying out what we talk about in the studio all the time, but in this case, taking the role of developer. So lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about health and wellness as part of an environmental bent on equity and what that means. And so for design professionals, we think of ourselves as stewards, and just reminding ourselves that beyond designing a building, we're trying to integrate, especially housing, into a context that's going to be the highest and best use, but also as successful as possible with respect to the cost it takes to maintain and operate it. So, very interested in how to work through specific performance-oriented design strategies for climate action. This diagram showing, 6 steps that can be implemented through design. The steps on the left represent the more easier integrated passive design strategies through proper orientation and use of materials, cutting down on energy needed, all the way to the right of the diagram where it's reliant on active ventilation and cooling systems, which are sort of the least desirable ways. So taking it upon, taking that idea into the problem of high density housing, this is a project that we did, high density, 17 units on a typical residential multifamily zone corner. We looked at, from a research standpoint, how historically that density had been integrated in a sort of thoughtful way, went through a series of analyses looking at circulation in particular, of how to sort of minimize the circulation, maximize the livable space, but do so in a way that would be a more diverse type of lifestyles and more eco-friendly. And so the result was a diagram that there was only one corridor in the entire project. It occurred on the 3rd level, the red rectangle. 96% of the space is livable space. These bays are repeated and stacked. There's a lot of misconceptions about efficiency, and the argument being that you have to stack boxes to be efficient. That's just not true. In this case, there was a central spine, and all the units took all their service delivery through this spine. All the systems were integrated into it, and all the units were daylighted and cross-ventilated to cut energy consumption. And in this case, you had 3 different living opportunities. You had a street and garden unit at the bottom. You had an L-shaped live-work unit in the middle of the building, and then you had a split-level unit at the top. Each of them very different square footages, ranging from a little over 1,000 square feet to about 1,800, so that they were different economic points in terms of its accessibility. And then different lifestyles that be accommodated and in a very sort of healthy type of environment. So environmentally responsive and flexible design, I think, is a mantra for housing going forward. And, in our studio at in West Hollywood, we've been starting to look at how to achieve a certain form of equity and flexibility through environmentally responsive design. This is just one example, looking at a different type of unit, dwelling unit, one that starts to incorporate a flex space or home office pod in this case. If in fact more and more people are going to be potentially working from home, the days of just trying to find a 2-bedroom unit and converting 1 bedroom into a home office doesn't make sense. Why are we not designing units to actually accommodate a space that can be closed off and designated as such for home office? And in terms of environmental responsiveness, here is an example of a very compact studio unit, over 500 square feet, that's set up to cross-ventilate and be naturally daylit, again with that sort of flex space home office pod. But in this case, using the private open space, which I might also say is the thing that most developers are trying to eliminate through their concessions in projects I'm but actually using that is a vital space to achieve daylighting and cross ventilation in a unit. I think it's something from an environmental standpoint that as we get more dense, if we're going to build a lot of housing without any space for private space, I think it's an incredibly lost opportunity. So then when you kind of take these ideas into a high density situation, we're looking at different scenarios. This happens to be a double loaded corridor configuration, but how do you get that daylighting and ventilation and lifestyle flexibility in these more intense and quantitatively increased housing situations? So to sum up, I think there's ways to be more in concert with nature directly through biophilic design, taking into account when we add this density that there's a whole other living going on in our urban areas that we want to be sensitive to and integrate through new housing, promoting wildlife, and even in the best of all situations, going beyond just green design or sustainable design and moving more towards restorative and regenerative design. And I think new housing projects could really move in this direction if we were to think through it. So last example is, how does this occur? Right? Well, we have a lot of underused or abandoned spaces in cities, particularly like alleys. What if we were to think about new ways of living that are climate responsive and economically active? If alleys were transformed through a housing project, for example. So most cities have distinct residential and commercial zones. One of the things I've been promoting and encouraging is looking at a live-work pocket that becomes a band between a commercial and residential zone. And in taking the ideas I talked about earlier for wealth building, subdivision, kind of own a piece of the rock, so to speak, with a transformed alleyway, you now get a new opportunity to add density in unconventional ways. And now you start to repeat that. Just this one strip in a typical urbanized area has the potential to add tens of thousands of housing units in a very eco-friendly, sensitive way, where an abandoned space can now be transformed through stormwater capture, through new wildlife habitats that are introduced, through live-work opportunities. A whole new economy is changed, that is introduced, that's neighborhood serving. All right, thank you. I'll turn it over to John.
Oh, thank you, Rick. That was very, very interesting. And I hope that, let me share my screen here. See. Okay, is that working for everyone? I think so.
Nope, not yet.
No. Share.
There you
How's
go.
that?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Well, this is so interesting to get two perspectives here from Ben and also Rick. And this is a combination of, I think that's interesting. We haven't actually coordinated our talks, but I think that my presentation will be a combination of the two here. So let me just pass forward to my next slide here. Here we go. So, when I was asked to be on this panel, I was wondering, like, what can I contribute to this? And I was thinking about, just as an architect who has been in practice, a fairly small firm, we're down to about 12 people since COVID, 12, 13 people, but we're still involved in a lot of housing. And I realized that, for a lot of architects, because the majority of our architects are smaller practitioners, there's not a lot one can do, because we're driven by our clients mostly. We're not doing large projects, and we're also, most of our work is derived from private sources. These are clients who have to be really responsive or socially responsible if they want to build housing, or affordable housing, that is. And so I was just thinking about, somehow, because what's most important is to be involved in your local community and actually respond to the local demand. And so I wanted to talk about that. So when we talk about equitable housing and building equitable communities, for me, we were talking about workforce housing. We're not talking about low-income housing. We're not talking about high-end, unaffordable housing that many architects do. But we're working on housing that actually responds and allows people to live in the communities where they work. And a majority of the people who are working are people of color. And that's why when we talk about equitability, we talk about, you know, and racism, for example, we do talk about, well, where is the housing being built and who's the housing being built for? So, and this is a pretty personal note for me, just because to let you know my background, I was born and raised in Long Beach, but my parents were born in Hawaii. And my father, through the luck of the GI Bill, managed to go, first one in his family to go to college. He went to MIT and Harvard. So he wasn't a stupid person. And decided to settle our family. There were 6 kids, settled in Long Beach. And, you know, there were covenants on the properties that they wanted to live in. So we actually were subjected to, you know, racial covenants. And we had to live in a small little 1,200 square foot house. This was in 1953 where my parents bought. But the house was 1,200 square feet, cost $12,000. So it's really interesting to understand that even though, you know, in this period of time in Southern California, where there was a kind of a need to build housing, there was a way that private developers decided to build housing. And so when we talk about equitable communities, especially nowadays, and the affordability of people to be able to live in the communities that they work, it's a very personal concern of mine. So I'm just going to go to, so the question is like, what can we do here? So this is my own personal story. So my husband and I were lucky to buy a house 6 years ago in Bolinas, which is a small coastal community that is about 30 miles away from San Francisco. And this was our weekend house, and we would come here every weekend. And now since COVID-19, we're living here full time. So very, very fortunate to live in this amazing community. And a short history of Bolinas is that, you know, before, it's a very unusual community because it's most well known for ripping down its Highway 1 sign and trying to be forgotten. It has an ancient history, of course. The Miwoks originally lived here, and then it was part of the original Spanish land grants. And then in the 70s, though, it became a destination for like the Summer of Love. There was a massive oil spill here in the town, and all these hippies came out from San Francisco to save the animals. And they discovered this amazing peninsula that was fairly rural and very undeveloped. And so they created their, in essence, a utopian society in a way, limiting the amount of growth. There was a lot of development pressure in the Marin Headlands. And there were proposals to fill in the lagoon and build a casino in the middle and become a next Marina del Rey. And so there was this, this idealism about, hey, how do we protect this area? Point Reyes became a national seashore. The GGNRA, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, was established. So the whole area around this community is preserved. So, and so having gotten this house 6 years ago, I became involved in the community and started doing pro bono work for the Bolinas Museum, and then got introduced to the Bolinas Community Land Trust, which is a nonprofit organization that's involved in building affordable housing. And their technique right now had been buying houses for sale if they could, or buying other properties in Bolinas and making them into permanently affordable rentable housing. So I met the director, Adrian. She's a powerhouse. She was the former school district president. And she's just been involved in the community. She's lived here for like 33 years or so. And we walked the property, which is next to Smiley's, which is this, oh shoot, I just messed up here. Let me go back to my here. there's a bar and then there's an empty lot next door. And she said, well, you know, we're thinking of getting this piece of property, and we are looking for someone to donate the land, etc. And we'd like to build housing on it. And so I started doing research on it, and it's like, wow, this is the only densest area that one can build, because it's in the coastal village zone. And so I came up with a quick sketch, which is to the right here, which is a little, it's actually an 8-unit building that we're proposing for the community. And this morphed into actually 6 months after we walked the land, she explained to me, oh, well, I found an anonymous donor who's going to privately donate, has committed all the funds to buy the land and also build this construction. So it was like a miracle in my mind. And so now this is the further development. We started the coastal permit process, and there's going to be 4 units in front that contain 3 bedrooms, and then 4 units in the rear that contain 4 2-bedrooms. And then there's because it's in the coastal village zone, we're required to have a retail space. And get this, we're adding 20 parking spaces, because that seems to be the biggest concern for this community, is the fact that people like to drive downtown and they want to be able to find parking. So we're over parking this area. I know this it's an antithesis of what one would want to do in an ecologically sensitive area, but in this case, we are dealing with a lot of local politics. And then 6 months later, which was really interesting, Adrian approached me again. She said, hey, John, we're about to buy some other land up on the Big Mesa. And there's an area here that is under the Williamson Act, which is basically a permanently deeded agricultural zone. And we want to build housing for farm workers. And those are mostly the Latinx community here in the town. And so in this case, there's been several iterations of this, but because it's under the Williamson Act and because it has to be farm worker housing, there's been these new thoughts about, well, let's create a co-op for all the 5 local organic farms and create a development to replace. Currently, there are these ramshackle shacks of people living on this land, but they don't have running water and they don't have running sewer. It's actually been a red tag community for a while, and a number one kind of on the list of Marin County to get solved. So here we're going to be using a prefab system and developing up to about 20 units of housing along the small strip of land here. And then there'll be a co-op that's going to be created to share in drying barns, tractor repair. So it's a new thinking and a new creative way of how do you build housing on land that is restricted. So that's, and then let me see, let's go to the next slide. So how does this happen? And it's basically just being involved in the community and being able to think out of the box and problem solving. I'd say that, interesting enough, even though this community is fairly rural, the population used to be about 2,000, and I think it's shrunk down to about 1,000 now. There still is a lot of resistance to even the downtown project. And the concerns have to do with density. And there have been comments, mostly through Nextdoor, which is, as I call it, the amplification of one, which comes down to the concept of, you know, there's going to be 20 to 24 people living downtown in this small community. And so it's really interesting to see, even in such a small rural town, you would get still the NIMBYistic attitude that, you know, this represents change. We're going to have problems with parking, and that we don't want the number of people living downtown, even though this community is so small. You would think that they would understand that stabilizing workforce housing and providing bedrooms for up to 24 or 30 people is actually not going to have a major impact. So, oh shoot, sorry, I messed up again here. Let's go back here. And then lastly, I just wanted to say that, you know, being involved in the community, I've also, my studio's still in the mission. I've had my building in the mission for 21 years. And so just being locally involved. This is an example of St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church, which is at 15th and Julian. and they've approached me to, they have a adjacent lot next to their church where they'd like to build housing. So we're looking at exploring building up to 24 units of workforce housing here. And then lastly, I wanted to end with Ben Metcalf's also conclusion about ADUs. I think that smaller practitioners who are working mostly on residential can encourage their clients to put in ADUs because it's such a great asset. It allows more people to live in a single family neighborhood. It also is, they are affordable by design. So on the left, I just wanted to show this is the first ADU in a brand new single family house that the Planning Commission in San Francisco approved. It was a very complicated process because they hadn't worked out the sequencing of, if you tear down a house, can you put an ADU in it? And this was the first case that they did allow that. The one on the right is actually a restoration of a 6-unit Romeo flat type building. And here the owner decided or asked us to try to squeeze an ADU. So we're doing 4 in the bottom in the basement area. So it is possible, I think, to get the private developers to put in units, understanding that it's not a detriment, and also it's definitely addressing a need. And I think that is accessible to many people, and also smaller architects who are practicing. So that's my conclusion. So I hope that everyone can, everyone can make a difference. And I think it's about speaking about housing and advocating for where you can find the units and pushing back and being involved in your local community.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks. So if you would want to stop sharing your screen, thank you.
Yes, sorry about that.
No, that's okay. We are basically at time, but I'm going to throw one question out there for everybody, which is, are there projects or policies that you're aware of anywhere in the state or throughout the state that have been particularly effective in advancing equity and climate responsiveness as a complete response? Or as a complete issue? Maybe Ben is best equipped to answer that, but.
Yeah, so I don't think I have a specific project that I can offer at hand, but I do think that what I mentioned earlier about the regional housing needs allocation process and the changes that have been made to it are worth bearing in mind. So there is an obligation now by state law that every California community needs to go through over really the next 18 months, a process of reassessing their existing zoning and all of their existing regulatory constraints with a statutory imperative to do that upzoning in ways that align with the state's climate change goals, regional climate planning frameworks, and to do it in a way that furthers fair housing. So that's a mighty challenge that every city in California is being faced with. And I think every city is going to do it in different ways. But it's an opportunity for all of us as practitioners to engage locally with our communities to help push them to take that honestly, take that challenge on honestly, and to do it as best they can.
John or Rick, do you guys want to take a stab at that question? Try to.
Adrian, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Sure. Are there any projects or policies that you're aware of in the state that have been particularly effective in the advancement of equity and climate response?
No, I mean, I know that we're all pushing towards, environmental responsibility and trying to get off the grid. The electric, obviously, San Francisco just passed its all electric, and many of the peninsula communities are going to all electric buildings. But again, I go back to it's, social justice. How does that relate? Of course, certainly, I just saw that there was a new state law that was being passed about having communities vote on if they want to have power plants in their neighborhoods, etc. I believe that's the synopsis of it. I think it's really a complicated thing. The biggest thing about equitability, I think, is just that, these communities, especially inner cities, are they investing in them? And when you talk about actually housing that is built for profit, that's the thing, it's for profit. Mm-hmm. And so we're struggling with the fact that we are so it's so expensive to build in California. You know, when a unit in San Francisco costs $750,000 out of the ground, you know, what does that mean for people who are making $30,000, $40,000 a year? You can't afford that, and there's no way, and we don't have enough government subsidies, tax incentives, et cetera, to fund this. So I think the trick, as I've always said, is that if you can make a way or some kind of program that would encourage private equity to fund affordable housing. And I know that everyone says, oh, there's this tax programs, et cetera, but I don't really see that meeting the demand at all.
Mm-hmm. Seeing no other questions in the chat. Yeah, I mean, John, Ben, Rick, what kind of advocacy really opens the doors to these key housing types, whether it's live work or co-housing or infill, small lot development, scattered site development, that are currently really difficult to entitle or construct?
You know, I'll mention one program that I think is helpful for us to be aware of. So the state of California has, through its climate work, provided a auction process for polluters and emitters. They get up to a cap, they have to buy their way out of that. These are large factories and so on and so forth. There is an auction process, so emitters can buy their way out. Those funds are generated, they go into a big pot. It's California's cap and trade pot. And over the last 5 years, it's been throwing off, you know, more than $1 billion a year, maybe $2 billion a year in a good year. About a quarter of those funds are earmarked for investments by the state that do intentionally further sustainable communities, affordable housing, social, environmental justice, and racial equity goals. And so I think some of the more interesting, innovative work is being funded out of that vehicle. So that includes projects, sort of multidimensional, holistic, very dense projects of transit, interesting work to sort of buy easement rights from farmers, you know, to prevent sprawl, as well as what's called the Transformative Climate Community Program, which does catalytic investments into some of the most impacted neighborhoods with the histories of racial segregation, histories of environmental pollution, to help them holistically sort of mobilize to tackle these problems. I think it's really inspiring work. I think it's really lifting up great models of practice. To John's point, it's just scraping the surface. Even with $500 million a year, we're just scraping the surface of the need that's out there. And so trying to think about ways to sort of unlock the market and channel the market is really the biggest game in town. You know, we in a good year, maybe we help subsidize 20,000 affordable units, but we right now are losing maybe 100,000 units every year as they get priced out of range of what a median family. So we have to figure out how to combat those systemic challenges.
And I do think it is about building community in a way. I mean, we're like, even as I said, it's just funny in Bolinas here. You know, the school district has dropped from 180 kids to about 90 kids a year. And so, you know, statistically, for example, the teachers, there were 20 teachers and 18 of them lived locally, 2 came over the hill. And now it's the opposite, where 18 are driving in and 2 are living here locally. So you can see that actually this massive change of workforce, and this destroys communities. So I think the concept of we're all in this together versus we have ours and therefore we don't want anyone else here. I mean, no one talks about, or that's part of us. We as architects create communities, but we can't just force it. It has to happen naturally, and there has to be organization of the community to say, hey, this is what we want. I know as an architect, I bridle against planning codes because that's bureaucracy, but it's like, well, actually, how do we all collectively get together and say, this is a problem for all of us? When I talk about, you know, when we had the former president, hopefully we'll finally get out of the White House, but when that person was talking about building a wall, I said, well, what's worse though is in California, we have an economic wall. We have an economic wall that's preventing people from living in the communities where they're working. Is that a problem? I think it is. And that's what we need to do, is again, talk about always, why is density okay? Appropriate density. Is it going to affect you that we have another family living in the basement of my house? It's a question. Is it always about parking?
Yeah. Well, and then there are certain densities that particularly cities need to support various types of infrastructure, right? So if
Yes.
the density is too low, then infrastructure is going to be unsuccessful. So there, it becomes something that is all encompassing. So actually not seeing any other questions in the Q&A, and I want to thank our panelists today. Thank you, Ben, Rick, and John. And I want to wrap up here because we are over time, and I want to appreciate everyone's participation in the conversation.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.